Welcome to another episode of Greenfields Green Dollars. My name is Rachel Henry. I'm a Water Quality Associate with OSU Extension.
And I'm Clint Schrader, the Program Manager with Ohio Farm Business Analysis.
And also joining us today is my coworker and PhD student, Amber Emmons.
Yeah, my name's Amber Emmons. Same job as Rachel, Water Quality Associate, just different counties, but I'm also working on my PhD in weed science.
So today we are combining our two interest areas, weed science and cover crops, to talk a little bit about integrated weed management and how cover crops can interact with that. So let's start off talking about the agronomic implications of weed control, or the lack thereof, I guess.
Well, the biggest thing is everybody uses some form of weed control, and you should, because if you have no kind of weed control, whether it's cover crops, herbicides, or anything else you'd like to use in your toolbox, if you're looking at soybeans specifically, you could always end up with up to an 80% loss of yield if you have no control whatsoever that year.
So that's a big drop in yield if we're not paying attention to those weeds. So cover crops play a big role in integrated weed management, which is?
Because it's part of the toolbox. We have a lot of weeds nowadays that have a lot of resistance. In Ohio, we have several species, 5 or 6 at this point, that have 2 or more resistances. And that list is constantly growing. The list of species that are also just gaining resistance, so meaning they have 1 now, is growing. So the concern is we need to make sure we have plenty of things in our toolbox.
So in addition to herbicides, cover crops give us another option for controlling weeds.
Yes.
So they do that through 3 main ways, right? Competition. So plants need light, oxygen, water, nutrients to grow. And cover crops growing in that same field are going to take some of those resources away. So that's one way. Allelopathy is another. So that's just releasing a chemical that inhibits weed seed germination. The third is suppression, and you guys actually have some trial data on that, right?
Yes, there was a trial done back in 2018 to 2021 where they're looking at trying to get some numbers to put on, okay, weeds can be suppressed with cover crops. What does that mean? What are the numbers behind that? So they looked at using a cereal rye cover crop, and they had 3 different treatments where they killed the cover crop pre-planting, 7 days post, and 21 days after. And the 21 days after is this treatment that if weather or some kind of outside control delayed you from getting that cover crop killed, what would it look like? And they were specifically looking at foxtails and giant ragweed in this study. The biggest thing was that they saw that later in the season they did see a reduction that was significant in the foxtail present in that field later, which is a good thing, we would like to say, because foxtail is on that list of species that they're gaining herbicide resistance.
Right. Foxtail can be kind of nasty if it gets let loose in your field.
Yeah, and so in that specific study, did they see any sort of yield penalty or benefit associated with the cover crops?
Generally, that pre-plant or 7 days post had the best yields and the best control of suppression they saw throughout the season. That 21 days after killing that cover crop, they saw a yield drop. It's also the same thing. They saw less mulch or less cover crop present to try and suppress it throughout the season. So generally, if you can kill that cover crop as close to planting, pre or right at 7 days after is probably the better option.
Right. It's good that they added that 21-day in, though, because in real life, the weather doesn't always cooperate.
Yes.
And so going back to the allelopathy for a second, are all species of cover crops going to provide that benefit, or is it only certain ones that we really associate that with?
Right. No, not all species. In fact, the main one is cereal rye. There's been anecdotes and a little bit of research on if other species do, but generally it's understood that cereal rye is kind of the main one, right? So, although other species offer different benefits to whether that's competition or suppression, cereal rye is our main allelopathic cover crop species.
Yeah, I think that ties in well with some of the economic data that I see looking at soybeans grown after a rye cover crop. That's where we do see some of those reduced input costs. And so for in Ohio, for example, in 2024, soybeans after a cover crop, we spent $3.09 less on chemicals, and then they also had a $9.59 less on custom hires. So in total, those farms saved about $12, almost $13 an acre in lower input costs because they utilized that cover crop. And we kind of hit on that in a previous video, but really, some cost savings on those particular categories.
Right.
Which is good. A lot of times if you ask farmers why they're growing cover crops, one of the big reasons, not always the first reason, but maybe that second or third reason is they want to reduce herbicide inputs and or they just want weed suppression.
Right, and that's better for ecological impact, right? So off-target species, things like that. But also for our soil health and also for growing cover crops. Sometimes we have issues with herbicide carryover. Do you have any info you can share on that?
Herbicide carryover can sometimes be an issue just because a lot of times we see herbicides that aren't labeled for the plethora of different species guys grow for a cover crop. So it's kind of the question of, okay, if I use this in my in-season crop, my cash crop, or if I'm going to use this to terminate my cover crop, what are the interactions going to look like? Is my soybean going to be okay? Will my cover crop actually come up? Is there going to be something residing in the soil? And there's a lot of issues with that. There are a lot of resources though. You want to look at Take Action, have a nice fact sheet over that, and they'll actually break it down by species and by herbicide, hopefully to help you get some data of like what they actually saw and what was the percent reduction they saw in stands from herbicide carryover. So there can be issues. Not always the easiest to find the answers to though.
Right. The important thing is just planning ahead and
Yes.
looking at those labels and looking at the species and just seeing what works.
So another potential challenge. So we're here in a field that's been seeded with cover crops. This was actually tiled. It was wheat, and then it was tiled, and then they had planted cover crops after. But you know, that's another one where we see a challenge sometimes depending on weather or what have you, and depending on our growing season, whether it's short or long. So here we've got a nice stand of cover crops, multi-species. But on the other side of the tree line, there's actually a cornfield that had cereal rye flown on, and they have a pretty poor stand just because we've been so dry here, this fall. And so I think that's another one where we think about our challenges, and getting enough biomass out there to get that weed suppression. It does involve a heavier stand and planting in a method that's going to allow you to have that good stand.
Yeah, so even if you plan and you know you want to use cover crops as a tool in your toolbox, sometimes Mother Nature or other outside influences decide it may not work this year.
Yep. And that's another reason that species selection is so important. If you know that your field is generally more dry, then you're probably going to want something that has a deeper root, maybe doesn't need as much moisture to germinate and start growing, or something that can just grow in a quick window, and then once that first freeze hits, it's done. So it's kind of a trade-off with cover crops, knowing all of the planning that goes into it and that it may not work out, needing plan B, C, D, E, and F. But overall, we do see real benefits to weed control, to soil health from these cover crops.
Thanks for joining us.